Revenge is all he wants, and he will get it no matter the cost. This is the story of Minecraft's Faceless Villager. It all begins on one sunny morning in just a normal plains village. And life was good in that village, as there was always enough food, the villagers always had jobs, and their homes were warm and secure. And so all the villagers were very happy living there in that village. However, very soon, things would start to change, as it was on that night that hundreds, if not thousands, of black kittens emerged into the village, all coming from the foundations of one of the villagers' houses. Now, this was very strange, as there had never been this many kittens within the village before. But still, all was good there. And even though black cats were seen as an omen of bad luck, these kittens just seemed to be harmless. And so for that reason, life just carried on as normal. Until one morning when all the villagers woke up and they saw that all of their crops were dead. This was bad, very bad, as they had no other crops to eat, and so for that reason, they were going to starve. But, very luckily, there was one villager who was able to save them all, as that villager had copies of all the seeds that they were growing, and so, with those seeds, they would all be saved. Now, that villager was the same villager whose house had spawned all those cats, and so many were very suspicious of him and those seeds. But still, at the same time, this was their only hope of survival, and so they just took those seeds and planted them. And well, just a few days later, they had it, as all those seeds had grown into fully ripened crops. This was amazing, as normally this would take months, but those seeds only took a few days. And so, once all the crops were ready, the villagers collected them all, and they began to eat them. This was great. They were going to survive. Or so they thought. As just a few days later, after beginning to eat those crops, many villagers suddenly died of poisoning. And those lucky enough not to die were severely sick. So sick in fact that all of the villagers were unable to work. Well, that was with the exception of one villager, that being the one that gave them all those seeds. And so, because he didn't get sick, suspicion of that villager grew quite dramatically, as many villagers began to suspect that he was intentionally doing all this. However, that feeling quickly went away, as just a few days later, all the villagers thankfully recovered, and no more died from those crops. In fact, after that point, none of them even got sick because of those crops. And so, once again, all was good in that village. But then, just a few weeks later, on one dark night, a storm consumed that village and annihilated all of the villagers' houses. Now, luckily, most of the villagers were able to escape the dangers of that storm, and thus, most of them survived. And so, the surviving villagers were all huddling together in the town centre, discussing what they needed to do next, since their entire town was completely destroyed. But as they were doing that, they suddenly realized something. That being that villager, the one whose house had all those cats, and the one who gave them those poison crops, well, his house was the sole standing building within that village. And so really, this was the final sign that all the villagers needed to prove that that villager was causing all these problems. They just thought that he had to, as why else would every single odd occurrence within the recent past all link back to him, and why would his house remain standing? And so because of all that, all the villagers began to believe that he was a witch. And so With that, all the villagers began to angrily march towards his house, ready to raid it. Now, that villager was still asleep at that time, as his house was secure, and so he didn't even hear the storm outside. However, that meant that when all the villagers broke into his house, he was too tired to fight back. And so for that reason, the villagers were very easily able to haul him away. And so it was then that they forcefully moved him a few hundred blocks away, and then they tied him to an oak log, and then they set that oak log and the entire forest that it was within ablaze. And so all the villagers began to watch on from a distance as the fire began to spread closer and closer to that villager tied on that tree. And they were excited to see him gone at last, as they didn't want any more odd occurrences happening in their village. Now, by this time, that villager was fully awake, and he was crying out for help, as he had no idea why this was happening. He was innocent, because he didn't mean for any of those strange things to happen. But really, the other villagers didn't care for his plea for help, as they all knew that he was lying. And so, all the villagers watched on for the next few minutes until the fire reached him. And so, it was then that all the villagers left the area, as they knew that that witch was going to die now, and they wanted him to die alone. And so that villager, seeing the fire spreading across his body, knew that his time was limited. And so he tried everything to get out of this, but nothing was working. And so he just watched the world around him slowly being consumed by fire and smoke as his health began to diminish. But then, just as he thought that he was going to die, he was somehow able to untie his restraints, and thus he was then able to run out of that fire. However, he didn't get out fast enough, as by the time that he was away from all that heat, he was still burning, and he knew that he had sustained serious damage. And thus, he knew that he was going to die, no matter what he did. But then, he saw something that might be able to reduce his suffering in his final moments, as he saw a river. And so he ran as fast as his injured body would allow him to, and he leapt into it. And well, as soon as he did that, he felt a sudden wave of relief wash over him, as that fire that he was attached to suddenly was extinguished. But still, this wasn't enough, as he knew that by jumping in that river and putting out that fire, he had only really delayed the inevitable. And so, understanding that, he decided to spend the last few minutes of his life walking along the riverbed, just taking in this magical sight of the world for one last time. But then, just as he began to do that, he heard something. It was a groaning sound, and so intrigued, he ran over to see what it was. And well, what he ended up seeing shocked him, as he saw a baby zombie. But they were on fire, as they were stuck in a pool of lava. And so that villager was consumed with sadness when he saw that, as he understood the pain that young zombie was enduring. And so, even though zombies were the mortal enemies of the villagers, he knew he had to help, as he couldn't bear to see such an innocent young soul suffer this much. And so, using a bucket, he picked up some water from that nearby river, and then he dumped it on the lava, which caused it all to cool instantly. And thus, he saved the baby zombie. But then, once he did that, his injuries got the better of him, and so he fell to the ground as his world went dark. several days passed when somehow he regained consciousness and he was now in a dungeon. That wasn't right. He was meant to be dead. But he also couldn't see anything. He had gone blind. And well, the reason for that was that he had no face anymore, as it had been burned off completely. But then that leaves a question of how is he still alive without a face? Well, as it turns out, once he saved that baby zombie from near certain death and then fainted, that baby zombie ran over to the other zombies and told them what had happened and how a villager had saved him. And well, those zombies, hearing about the heroic actions of that villager, ran over to that dying hero and picked him up, where they then moved him down into the dungeons that they reside in. And then they called over an evoker, whom then casted some dark, magical spells to keep that villager alive. Now, this spell, keeping that villager alive, while amazing, also came with some costs. Most notably, the loss of his face, which, by this point, had mostly been burnt away. Meaning, he had lost his eyesight, and the ability to smell anything, and the ability to taste anything. But at least he was still alive. And more than that, the zombies decided to give him a fun new name to cheer him up. That being the Faceless Villager. And really, it wasn't all that bad losing his face, as all of his other senses were heightened to the extreme, meaning he now had amazing hearing, and his punching powers were far stronger too, as now he would have the strength to kill a villager, or in fact, any mob, in just one hit, if he so desired to. And his hearing ability was so strong that he could hear any sound from more than 10,000 blocks away. And so, after learning all that had happened to him, and these new powers that he had gained, the Faceless Villager just had to stand there for a moment to think about his life. How the villagers had all betrayed him, and how the supposedly evil zombies and illagers had saved him. And so, it was then that he realised that the zombies and the illagers were really the heroes within the world. And so, after comprehending that fact, he then went to speak to the zombies within that dungeon, where he then asked them if he could join them in the next raid of those evil villagers. Now, when they first heard this, they thought he was just joking, as how would the Faceless Villager be any help to them in any raids? But at the same time, they also saw the serious demeanor on the Faceless Villager, and they could see how he was desperate for revenge for the villagers that had wronged him. And well, having an extra fighter surely wouldn't hurt them. And so for that reason, they agreed to his request. And thus, it was only a few hours later that a swarm of zombies, along with the Faceless Villager, were heading over to the exact same village that the Faceless Villager had originated from. And so, all was good to begin with, as we were getting closer and closer and closer to that village, and the Faceless Villager was excited, as he couldn't wait to get his revenge. However, when they finally arrived in that village and were all ready to fight the villagers, the Faceless Villager took his first steps back in that village, which caused something completely unexpected to occur, as the entire village was suddenly filled with a dark blue aura, and everything went cold as time began to slow down within that village. All the zombies stopped moving as they began to observe these changes, as this was not what that evoker's spells were meant to do to the Faceless Villager. But then the Faceless Villager took his second step within that village, and when he did that, something even more shocking happened, as all the villagers at that moment, suddenly went blind, as they too lost their faces. But not just that, they also lost every other sense as well. And so, for that reason, all the villagers could do was to just run around aimlessly, screaming out for help. And so, seeing this strange occurrence and this moment of weakness, the zombies and the Faceless Villager began their raid. And in just a few minutes, it was over, as they had won it. As the villagers were unable to run to safety, and the Faceless Villager could hear their every steps. And so, the moment that they made a move, he could just run over to them, and then, using his heightened physical strength, he could kill the villagers in just one hit. It was that simple. Now, this was very weird, but maybe this all just happened because this was the home village of the Faceless Villager, and he was desperate for revenge. And so with that, they all just marched on and moved to the next village. But once again, the air went cold, time began to slow down, and the entire village was consumed in a blue aura as all the villagers began to lose their faces. And so, once again, they were able to complete that raid in mere seconds, as the Faceless Villager kept on repeating that he wanted revenge, and that he would only get it once all the villagers within the overworld were dead. That was his goal. And so, hearing that was great news for the zombies, as they now had a loyal soldier who was incredibly powerful that wanted to fight alongside them. And so together, they marched on to the next village and killed all the villagers. And then they marched on to the next village and did the same thing, and the next village, and the next village, and the next village, and so on for the next few decades. And so, as the Faceless Villager and his entourage moved across the world, terrorizing more and more villagers, legends would soon start to spread of him, as villages all over the world began to get increasingly scared of the Faceless Villager, fearing that he might visit them next. And so because of that, many villagers began to tell stories of him in the hopes that they could warn others of his attacks, and thus they could better prepare. And the villagers also soon learned of this Faceless Villager, but unlike the villagers, they did not fear him. No, instead, they wanted to learn more about him. And so for that reason, they sent out messengers to go and travel the world and find him. And so, after a few months, one of the messengers was able to find the Faceless Villager as he was marching forward with his army of zombies. And somehow, that messenger was then able to convince him to go over to one of the woodland mansions. And so, once he agreed to that, the Faceless Villager was led across the world and over to one particular woodland mansion. And well, as soon as he entered it, he was met with respect and gratitude. Now, he was somewhat shocked to experience that, as throughout his whole life, he had always believed that the woodland mansions were fortresses of endless suffering. But no, those were all lies sprouted by the evil villagers, as these villagers were so nice. And so, after realizing that, the Faceless Villager was then led across the soft carpeted floors of the woodland mansion, and was directed over to their experimentation room, where they then ran many experiments on him to see how he gained these unintentional powers, as that evoker never meant to give him those powers. However, after running these tests for several hours, they were unable to discover anything conclusive about the origins of his powers. However, on the other hand, they did learn something that would change the Faceless Villager forever, as they learned of a way that he might be able to see again while still retaining all of his powers and heightened senses. And that would all happen if he just fused a few Eyes of Ender into himself. Now, the Illagers knew that in order to create Eyes of Ender, then one would have to go into the Nether. And well, that was something that they were not willing to do. However, when they told the Faceless Villager what he could do to regain his vision, he was more than willing to go to the Nether and try to create those Eyes of Ender. Because if he could see and still have all these powers, well then, nothing could stop him, as he would become the greatest being ever known to the overworld. Or so he knew of. And so, with that, he ran out of the Woodland Mansion with a group of evokers following him. And together, they went over to a ruined portal. And so then, the evokers restored that portal and wished him all the best and ran away. As really, they were just too terrified of the Nether and couldn't bear to see that portal. Now, that Faceless Villager was scared, as he had no idea what it was going to be like in that world, and the fact that the Illagers were terrified of it only added to his fear. But really, he had faith that it would all work out in the end. And so, bravely, he ran through that portal, and in just a few seconds, he was taken to the Nether. Instantly, he began to feel hot, very hot, as, after all, this was a world forged from fire. But still, he was okay, and he wasn't taking any damage. And so, it was then that he began to utilize his amazing hearing abilities so that he could locate a piglin, which he was told sounded like a pig. And so, once he was able to do that, he then ran over to him, and he was then able to barter with that piglin using the limited gold that he was given by the Illagers. And thankfully, that gold was enough for him to get 10 Ender Pearls. This was good. He now had 50% of what he needed. And so now, he knew that he just had to go to a fortress, because there were meant to be these strange flying orange beasts that, when killed, would drop a rod of solidified heat, which could then be used along with the pearls to create the Eyes of Ender. And so, as this beast was described to be a fiery, metallic monster, he just had to listen out for that kind of sound. And so, over the next few days, the Faceless Villager travelled across the Warp Forests, and the Crimson Forests, and the Basalt Deltas, and the Soul Sand Valley. And he was staying relatively far away from the deadly Nether beings. Also, he had to walk rather slowly, as he had to be very cautious with all the lava that resided within the Nether. But after a few days of meticulously and carefully travelling the Nether, he finally heard it. The sound of a blaze. And it was really close. And so excited, he began to run towards it. However, he was blind. And so for that reason, he didn't see that there was a hole between him and the fortress. And so because of that, he began to fall down to the ground rapidly. Oh no, he thought he was going to die, as he wasn't very resistant to fall damage. But then, just a few seconds later, he felt it, as he just landed in an ocean of lava. And so, he was burning, and it was the same sensation as before when he was on that tree. So he just had to stand there, preparing to die. But then he realized something. He wasn't taking any damage because he just learned that he was fire resistant. And so with that, he was then able to swim out of that lava ocean and was safe. And so after that, he jumped over the subscribe button, climbed up a tree, and climbed through their fortress. And in just a few minutes, he was back to where he wanted to be. This was great. And so all he had to do now was to just stand still and wait for the blaze to make a sound. And so, just a few seconds later, when it moved, he heard its movement, and thus he knew where it was. And so, he ran for it. And in just one hit, he killed the blaze and stole its rods. And so he then did that 4 more times, killing 4 more blazes, and thus was able to collect all the rods that he needed. And so it was then that he finally had all the resources that he would need to create the Eyes of Ender. And thus, with that, he then began to head back to that nether portal. And just a few hours later, he was back in the overworld. This was it now. He was just going to fuse those materials, make the Eyes of Ender, and get his vision back to become a god. And so he broke down the blaze rods into powder, and then he fused that powder with the pearls, and thus the Eyes of Ender were created. But very weirdly, he could somehow see these Eyes of Ender, even though at this point he still didn't have a face. And so, really, this was a clear sign to the Faceless Villager that he was about to see again, as nothing else was like that. And so, he picked up all those Ender Eyes and began to try and fuse them into him. However, as he tried to do that, the Ender Eyes just floated away into the sky. That was weird. And so he tried to do it again, but once again the eyes just went up in the sky. Maybe those Eyes of Ender were just doing that because he was too close to that portal. And so thinking that, he walked away from that portal and he tried to fuse those eyes into him once again. However, as he did that, the eyes went up into the sky again, but this time they went up in a slightly different direction. That was odd. And so he moved again and tried to fuse the Eyes of Ender into him, but once again the eyes floated up in the sky and again in a different direction. And so he stood there for a moment thinking about it, when he realized something. All those Eyes of Ender were pointing to something. And so he then began to travel the world, following the directions of the Eyes of Ender. And so it would be over the next few months that he swam through oceans, climbed over mountains, and ran through forests, all until the Ender Eyes stopped going up and instead began to flow downwards. That was weird. And so he began to mine straight down, following the path of the Ender Eyes. And he continued to do that until he ended up in an opening. Now, he could hear the water flowing around him, but he could also hear a regular echo. And so that meant that he was in a room, not a cave. And so he was getting close. And thus he decided to throw one more eye. But when he did that, it just slowly hovered into the next room. Okay, he must be very close to where the eyes were directing him now. And so he followed that Ender Eye and he ended up in another room where he could see something else. It was a portal frame, and some of those frames had Eyes of Ender within them. Wait, that was weird. Why were their eyes already here in the overworld? And so he stood there for a moment, thinking what to do next, when he realized that if some of the frames already had eyes in them, but some didn't, perhaps all he had to do to gain his vision was to just fill in the missing eye slots within the frames. And so the Faceless Villager began to place his Eyes of Ender into each of those empty portal frames. But once he placed the final eye, he heard a loud bang, and then a new portal opened up in the center of the frames. And he could see that portal as well. This was weird, as why was there a portal, and why could he see it? And so very quickly, he began to think that if he wanted to get his vision back, then all he had to do was to go inside that portal. And so, thinking that, he began to jump into that portal. However, before he could get into it, he just vanished. Now, that sounds rather sad, given that the Faceless Villager had gone on this grand quest, and this portal that he had spent so long working to create was just never going to be used. His life was all a waste, and well, he would never be able to fully get his revenge. However, maybe that wasn't entirely the case just yet, as just a few seconds later, a wandering trader would find its way into that portal room. And well, when he went into that portal, a whole new monster would be created, and that monster would do something that would potentially result in the death of all villagers, in fact, all life within the overworld. But to learn more about that and what happened next, then you'll need to watch this video.